Good evening. Tonight we descend into a story that spans 5,400 years and has killed more Americans than all our wars combined. This is a tale of chemistry and desperation, of science and suffering, of a substance so powerful and so seductive that it has broken every promise humanity has made to control it. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly value what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. This isn't a comfortable story. This is the story of morphine. The surgeon's hands are shaking, blood everywhere. The screaming never stops. It's 1863, somewhere in Virginia, and the boy on the table can't be more than 19. He's taken a Minier ball through the femur. The bone is shattered. Infection will set in within hours. There's only one choice. The saw waits. But first, the surgeon reaches for a small glass syringe and slides the needle into the soldier's arm. 30 seconds. The screaming stops. The boy's face goes slack. For the first time since the battle began, there is peace in this room. The surgeon picks up the saw. He doesn't know it yet, but that syringe will save this boy's life today, and it will destroy it for the next 30 years. How did humanity's miracle painkiller become a 2-century nightmare? That's what we're here to find out. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back. Much further back. Long before there was morphine, long before there was even a word for the chemistry that would one day explain its power, there was the poppy, Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy. And for 5,000 years, this single plant species quietly shaped human civilization in ways we are only now beginning to fully understand. The story starts in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now modern-day Iraq. The year is approximately 3400 BCE. Cuneiform tablets discovered in the ancient Sumerian city of Nippur contain some of the earliest written references to the opium poppy. The Sumerians had a name for it, carved into clay in their wedge-shaped script. Hulkil, the joy plant. Think about that for a moment. 5,400 years ago, before the pyramids of Egypt were built, before the wheel had spread across Europe, human beings had already identified this particular flower as a source of profound pleasure and relief. They knew it worked. They didn't know why. That answer would take another 5 millennia. But they knew. Picture it. Dawn breaks over a Sumerian field just outside the city walls. A priest in woven robes moves slowly between rows of poppies, each plant crowned with a bulbous seed pod the size of a child's fist. The flowers have already fallen away, leaving behind these green-gray pods that swell with potential. The priest carries a small bronze knife, its edge dulled deliberately to prevent cutting too deep. He approaches a pod and makes a series of shallow vertical incisions along its surface. 4 cuts, 5, 6. Not deep enough to pierce the interior, but deep enough to wound. And then the plant begins to bleed. From each incision, a milky white latex oozes out, thick and sticky, catching the early morning light. The priest moves on to the next plant, and the next, scoring hundreds of pods in methodical silence. This is not merely agriculture. This is ceremony. This is the harvesting of something sacred. By the next morning, the latex has oxidized in the air, turned dark brown, nearly black. The priest returns with a scraper and carefully collects the dried resin from each pod. This is opium in its rawest form, a concentrated amalgamation of more than 50 different alkaloid compounds, though of course the Sumerians had no such language for what they held. They only knew that when this resin was dissolved in wine or water and consumed, it brought a profound transformation. Pain vanished. Anxiety dissolved. The harsh edges of existence softened into something bearable, even beautiful. The Sumerians passed this knowledge to the Assyrians, who called the poppy gilhul in their own tongue. The Assyrians cultivated vast fields of it, and their medical texts, preserved on clay tablets now housed in museums across the world, describe opium as a treatment for everything from colic to battlefield wounds. But it was the Egyptians who truly elevated opium to an art form. By 1300 BCE, Thebes in Upper Egypt had become the epicenter of opium production in the ancient world. The city's fields stretched to the horizon, row upon row of poppies swaying in the desert heat. Egyptian physicians, the most advanced medical practitioners of their age, prescribed opium with sophisticated precision. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text dating to approximately 1550 BCE, contains more than 700 remedies, and opium appears repeatedly. For crying children, for headaches, for the pain of tumors, for the torment of dysentery. But the Egyptians understood something deeper. They recognized that opium was not merely a medicine, it was a gateway to the divine. In religious ceremonies, priests would consume opium before entering trance states, believing it allowed them to commune with the gods. Statues of Nefertem, the Egyptian god of healing and perfume, show him holding lotus flowers and poppies. The plant that brought relief from earthly suffering was the same plant that bridged the gap between mortal and immortal. The knowledge spread like roots beneath soil. By 400 BCE, opium had reached Greece, where it was called opium, from the Greek word opos, meaning juice. Hippocrates, the father of Western medicine, described opium in his writings and recommended it for a variety of ailments. But he also noted something troubling. Those who used it regularly seemed to need more and more to achieve the same effect. He couldn't explain it, he could only observe. A century later, Galen, perhaps the most influential physician in the ancient world, refined opium preparations into a compound called theriac, a complex mixture of opium, viper flesh, and dozens of other ingredients that was believed to be a universal antidote to poison. Theriac became so prized that it remained in medical use for more than 1,500 years, well into the 18th century. Galen's own version contained opium as its primary active ingredient, though he had no way of knowing which molecule within that black resin was doing the heavy lifting. And this is the pattern that would persist for thousands of years. Doctors knew opium worked. They knew it with absolute certainty because they could see the results with their own eyes. A patient writhing in agony would be given opium, and within an hour, the writhing would stop. The screams would cease. The body would relax into something approximating peace. But they had no idea what exactly within the opium was responsible for this miracle. They were prescribing magic they couldn't measure, wielding power they couldn't explain, treating patients with a substance whose effects they could observe but never truly understand. During the Islamic Golden Age, from roughly the 8th to the 13th century, Persian and Arab physicians pushed the boundaries of opium use even further. Avicenna, the towering figure of medieval medicine, whose canon of medicine would be used as a standard medical text in Europe for 600 years, wrote extensively about opium. He documented its pain-relieving properties, its ability to induce sleep, and, crucially, its dangers. He warned that excessive use could lead to dependence, that patients might waste away if given too much, that the line between medicine and poison was perilously thin. But even Avicenna, for all his brilliance, could not isolate the active compound. He could only describe its effects and issue warnings about its misuse. The secret remained locked inside the poppy, hidden in that dark resin, waiting for someone with the right combination of curiosity, chemistry knowledge, and desperation to finally crack it open. By the time opium reached Renaissance Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries, it had been in continuous use for more than 4,000 years. Paracelsus, the Swiss physician and alchemist, created a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol that he called laudanum, from the Latin word laudare, meaning to praise. He claimed it was the most powerful medicine ever created, and he wasn't entirely wrong. Laudanum became wildly popular across Europe, prescribed for everything from tuberculosis to menstrual cramps, to crying infants who wouldn't sleep. But here's the thing that haunted every physician who ever prescribed opium, from the Sumerian priests to the Renaissance doctors. They were working blind. Opium was inconsistent. The strength varied wildly depending on where the poppies were grown, how the resin was harvested, how it was prepared. One batch might be incredibly potent, the next nearly inert. Patients who responded well to one preparation might have no response to another. And dosing was a nightmare. Give too little, and the patient would continue to suffer. Give too much, and they might slip into unconsciousness and never wake up. Doctors were performing a high-stakes guessing game every time they reached for their opium preparations. They knew the plant contained something powerful, something transformative, but they had no way to standardize it, no way to isolate the active ingredient, no way to ensure that what they were giving to a patient in London was the same thing being given to a patient in Paris or Rome. By 1800, after 5,000 years of human use, opium remained fundamentally mysterious. It was the single most important pain reliever in the entire pharmacopoeia of human medicine, used on every continent, prescribed by every medical tradition from Chinese to European to Islamic. And yet no one, not the most brilliant chemist, not the most experienced physician, not the most dedicated researcher, could answer the most basic question about it. What exactly made it work? What was the molecule responsible for opium's power? What was the chemical structure of the substance that had shaped human civilization for longer than agriculture, longer than metallurgy, longer than almost anything else in our toolkit of survival? The answer was waiting in a cramped shop in Germany, in the hands of a young man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose except his curiosity. A young man who would grind opium resin late into the night, testing and filtering and crystallizing, driven by a question that had haunted humanity for 5 millennia. And when he found the answer, when he finally isolated that pure white crystalline powder and held it up to the candlelight and realized what he had done, the world would never be the same. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand who Friedrich Sertürner was, how he arrived at that moment, and why an orphaned pharmacist's apprentice working in obscurity would succeed where the greatest minds in medicine had failed for 5,000 years. That story begins with loss. Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Sertürner was born on June 19, 1783, in the small town of Neuhaus in Prussia, in what is now northwestern Germany. His father was an engineer working for Prince Bishop Friedrich Wilhelm von Westphalen. His mother's name is lost to history. one of countless women whose identities were deemed unworthy of preservation in the official records of the era. Friedrich was their son, raised in modest circumstances, educated in the basic sciences and mathematics that were considered appropriate for a boy of his station. And then, in 1798, when Friedrich was just 15 years old, both of his parents died. The records don't tell us how. Disease, most likely. Perhaps the same illness claimed them both. Perhaps they died separately, weeks or months apart, leaving young Friedrich to experience the grief twice over. What we know for certain is that by the age of 16, he was alone in the world, with no inheritance, no family connections, and no prospects beyond whatever he could create for himself through sheer determination. In 1799, Friedrich secured an apprenticeship with a pharmacist named Kramer in the town of Paderborn. It wasn't prestigious work. Pharmacy apprentices were essentially servants who ground powders, mixed tinctures, cleaned equipment, and ran errands for their masters. The pay was minimal. The hours were long. The work was repetitive and often tedious. But for an orphan with no other options, it was survival. Picture the shop. Small, dark, crowded with shelves bearing ceramic jars labeled in Latin, dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, the sharp smell of alcohol and bitter compounds, a wooden counter stained with decades of spilled medicines, and in the back, a small workroom with a mortar and pestle, scales, filters, and heating apparatus. This was where Friedrich spent his days, grinding plant materials into powders, following recipes passed down through generations, preparing the same medicines that had been prepared for centuries. One of the most frequently requested preparations was opium. Laudanum, primarily. Opium dissolved in alcohol. Prescribed for pain, cough, diarrhea, insomnia, and a dozen other complaints. Friedrich prepared it constantly, measuring out the dark resin, dissolving it in spirits, bottling it for customers, over and over and over, the same recipe, day after day. But Friedrich had a mind that couldn't accept repetition without understanding. As he ground opium resin in his mortar, he found himself troubled by a question that should have been simple but wasn't. What exactly was in this substance that made it work? Doctors had been using opium for thousands of years, but no one could explain its mechanism. No one knew which component of the resin was responsible for its effects. The standard medical wisdom was that opium worked because of some ineffable combination of all its parts, that the whole was somehow greater than the sum. But what if that wasn't true? What if there was one specific substance within the opium that was doing all the work? And what if that substance could be isolated, purified, and measured precisely? The implications were staggering. If you could isolate the active ingredient, you could standardize dosages. You could ensure that every preparation had the same potency. You could eliminate the dangerous guesswork that plagued opium prescriptions. You could, in theory, create a medicine that was reliable in ways opium had never been. It was an audacious question for a teenage apprentice to ask. The greatest chemists in Europe hadn't solved this problem. Universities with extensive resources and brilliant faculty hadn't cracked it. Why would an orphaned boy working in a provincial pharmacy succeed where they had failed? But Friedrich had two advantages. First, he had nothing to lose, no reputation to protect, no career to jeopardize if he failed. Second, he had time. Lots of time. Evenings after the shop closed, Sundays, early mornings before customers arrived. Hours and hours to experiment in solitude, driven by pure curiosity and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, he could discover something significant. In 1804, at the age of 21, Friedrich Sertürner began his experiments in earnest. He worked in secret, using his own meager funds to purchase small quantities of opium and the chemicals he needed for extraction. His method was based on a hunch that if opium contained a specific active substance, that substance might be an alkaline compound, the opposite of an acid. If he treated opium with various reagents, he might be able to precipitate out whatever was responsible for its effects. He started with crude opium resin, boiled it, mixed it with ammonia, filtered it, added acid, precipitated out solid matter, filtered again, redissolved, reprecipitated. The process was painstaking, repetitive, and conducted entirely by trial and error. He had no textbooks to guide him. This kind of plant chemistry didn't exist yet. He was inventing it as he went along. And then, one evening in late 1804, something extraordinary happened. After weeks of repetitive experimentation, Friedrich watched as a crystalline white powder precipitated out of his solution. It was unlike anything he'd seen before, pure, uniform, beautiful in its geometric regularity. He carefully collected it, dried it, and weighed it. Just a small amount, perhaps a few grams, but it was the first time anyone in human history had isolated a pure alkaloid from a plant. He called it Morphium, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams and sleep. It was a fitting name. This was the substance that had powered the dreams of Sumerian priests, the religious visions of Egyptian pharaohs, the pain relief of Greek warriors and Islamic scholars and European aristocrats. And now, for the first time, it existed in pure crystalline form. But naming it was the easy part. The hard part, the dangerous part, was figuring out what it did. Friedrich knew that the only way to truly test his discovery was on a living subject. In the early 1800s, there were no ethics boards, no regulatory agencies, no protocols for human testing. There was only the scientist, the substance, and the question of courage. Friedrich Sertürner had both the substance and the courage. What he didn't have was wisdom about dosing. He gathered 3 volunteers, 3 young boys from the neighborhood, their names lost to history. He gave them each a dose of his purified morphium, and then, in a decision that would haunt medical history, he took a dose himself. The exact amount is unknown, but it was almost certainly too much. Far too much. Within minutes, all 4 subjects began to experience the effects. First came euphoria, a profound sense of well-being, of warmth, of safety. Then came the drowsiness, heavy, irresistible, pulling them down into unconsciousness. Their breathing slowed, dangerously slow, their pupils constricted to pinpoints. Friedrich, still conscious but fading fast, realized with growing horror that he might have just killed himself and 3 children in pursuit of scientific knowledge. He forced them to stay awake, made them walk, kept them moving, gave them vinegar to drink, believing its acidity might counteract the alkaline morphium. For hours, he fought to keep them alive, fought to keep himself alive, while the substance he'd isolated coursed through their bloodstreams and suppressed every vital function. Eventually, the crisis passed. All 4 survived. But it was close, terrifyingly close. Friedrich Sertürner had stared into the abyss of his own creation and barely stepped back in time. Most people would have stopped there, would have recognized the danger and moved on to safer pursuits. But Friedrich wasn't most people. He'd just proven that his purified morphium was incredibly powerful. more powerful than crude opium, and therefore more dangerous, but also more useful if properly controlled. This was the breakthrough he'd been seeking, not just the isolation of the compound, but the confirmation that this specific substance was responsible for opium's effects. In 1805, Friedrich published his findings in a small, obscure journal called the Journal of Pharmacy for Physicians, Apothecaries and Chemists. His paper described his extraction method and his self-experimentation. It should have been recognized immediately as one of the most important scientific discoveries of the century. It wasn't. No one paid attention. The journal had limited circulation. Friedrich was unknown, unaffiliated with any university, and working in a provincial town far from the centers of European science. His claims seemed too extraordinary. A pharmacy apprentice, barely into his 20s, claiming to have solved a problem that had stumped the greatest minds for millennia. It was easy to dismiss, easier to ignore. For 12 years, Friedrich's discovery languished in obscurity. He continued working as a pharmacist, eventually buying his own shop in Einbeck, Germany. He married. He suffered from chronic arthritis that caused him constant pain, and he continued to experiment with morphium, not just in the laboratory, but on himself, using it to manage his own suffering. The irony would become clear only later. The man who isolated morphine, who gave humanity the power to relieve pain with unprecedented precision, was slowly becoming dependent on his own creation. The benefactor was becoming the victim. In 1817, Friedrich tried again. He published a more comprehensive paper, this time with detailed human trial data, in Gilbert's Annalen, a more prestigious journal. This time, the world listened. The French chemist Joseph Louis Gay Lussac read the paper, recognized its significance, and translated it into French. Suddenly, Friedrich Sertürner's work was being discussed in Paris, in London, in Vienna. The pharmaceutical company Merck, based in Darmstadt, Germany, began investigating commercial production of morphine. By 1827, Merck was producing morphine on a commercial scale. By 1831, Friedrich Sertürner received the Montyon Prize from the French Academy of Sciences, a prestigious award given for discoveries that benefit humanity. He was granted the honorary title, Benefactor of Humanity. It must have felt like vindication. After years of poverty, obscurity, and dismissal, Friedrich was finally being recognized for what he'd achieved. He'd done what 5,000 years of human civilization had failed to do. He'd cracked open the mystery of opium and pulled out its secret. But the story doesn't end with triumph. It ends with something darker. Friedrich Sertürner died on February 20th, 1841, at the age of 57. The exact cause of death remains unclear, but there are suggestions in the historical record that he may have been suffering from morphine addiction in his final years. The arthritis that had plagued him for decades drove him to use his own discovery more and more frequently. And morphine, as he'd learned during that terrifying self-experiment back in 1804, demanded more and more to produce the same effect. The man who gave humanity the power to banish pain may have been enslaved by it in the end, but his legacy was secure. Morphine had entered the world, and it would never leave. Within decades, it would become the most widely used pain reliever in medicine. It would revolutionize surgery, making procedures possible that would have been unthinkable without it. It would ease the suffering of millions, and it would also create addiction on a scale previously unknown. Because in 1853, just 12 years after Sertürner's death, another invention would arrive. something that would transform morphine from a carefully controlled tincture into a weapon of instant gratification and devastating dependence. The hypodermic syringe was about to change everything. In 1853, two men working independently in two different countries created the same invention in the same year. Alexander Wood, a Scottish physician practicing in Edinburgh, and Charles Gabriel Pravaz, a French surgeon working in Lyon, both developed what we now call the hypodermic syringe, a hollow needle attached to a plunger mechanism that could inject substances directly beneath the skin, into muscle, or even into veins. The coincidence is striking, but not entirely surprising. By the mid-19th century, medicine was advancing rapidly. Doctors understood anatomy with unprecedented detail. They'd begun to grasp the circulation of blood, and they were increasingly frustrated by the limitations of oral medication. When you gave a patient opium or morphine by mouth, it had to pass through the digestive system, where it was partially broken down and absorbed unpredictably. Some patients metabolized it quickly, others slowly. Some got intense effects, others barely responded. And it took time, sometimes an hour or more before relief arrived. But what if you could bypass the stomach entirely? What if you could deliver morphine directly into the tissue, where it could be absorbed immediately into the bloodstream? Alexander Wood's first test subject was an 80-year-old woman suffering from neuralgia, a condition that caused excruciating nerve pain along her face and jaw. Oral morphine hadn't helped. Nothing had helped. She was desperate. Wood prepared his syringe, loaded it with a solution of morphine, found a suitable location on her arm, and pushed the needle beneath her skin. The relief was nearly instantaneous. Within minutes, the pain that had tormented her for months simply vanished. She relaxed, smiled, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She felt peace. And then she didn't wake up for a full day. Wood had miscalculated the dose. What seemed like a reasonable amount of morphine for oral consumption was far too much when delivered directly into tissue. The woman survived, thankfully, but the incident made something very clear. The hypodermic syringe wasn't just a more convenient delivery method. It was a fundamentally different way of administering drugs, one that was vastly more powerful and therefore vastly more dangerous. But the advantages were impossible to ignore. Injection provided instant relief. It bypassed the stomach, eliminating the nausea that often accompanied oral opiates. It used smaller doses because there was no loss to metabolism during digestion. And for surgeons like Pravaz, who developed his syringe to inject coagulants directly into aneurysms, it opened up entirely new possibilities for treatment. The technology spread rapidly. By the 1860s, pharmaceutical companies were manufacturing syringes commercially. By the 1870s, according to medical historians, virtually every American physician carried one. The hypodermic syringe had gone from experimental curiosity to standard medical equipment in less than 2 decades. And then came the war. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the American Civil War began. Over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans would die in the bloodiest conflict the nation had ever experienced. The weapons, rifles, artillery, bayonets, were brutally efficient at creating casualties. Medical care, by contrast, was primitive by modern standards. Antiseptics hadn't been widely adopted yet. Germ theory was still controversial. Surgical techniques were crude. But there was one thing Civil War doctors had in abundance: morphine. And thanks to the recent invention of the hypodermic syringe, they could administer it quickly, easily, and in the middle of a battlefield. Picture a field, hospital behind the lines after a major engagement. Canvas tents stretched in rows, filled with wounded men on cots and blankets on the ground, the air thick with the smell of blood, gangrene, and chloroform. Surgeons in blood-stained aprons, moving from patient to patient, amputating limbs shattered by mini-balls, extracting shrapnel, probing wounds, and everywhere the screaming, the terrible, endless screaming of men in agony. The morphine syringe became a mercy in human form. A surgeon would approach a soldier whose leg had been mangled beyond repair. The man would be writhing, crying out, begging for death or relief or anything to make the pain stop. The surgeon would produce his syringe, find a vein, or simply inject into the muscle, and within moments, the screaming would quiet. The body would relax. The terror would drain from the soldier's eyes. And then the amputation could begin. Morphine was the most widely distributed medicine in the entire war. Union forces alone used nearly 10 million opium pills and nearly 3 million ounces of opium preparations during the conflict. The Confederacy, despite supply shortages, distributed morphine widely to their forces as well. Soldiers carried it in leather pouches around their necks. Officers had it in their field kits. Doctors administered it, not just for wounds, but for dysentery, which killed more soldiers than bullets did, for malaria, for the psychological trauma that we now call PTSD, but which had no name then beyond soldier's heart or nostalgia. And here's the crucial thing. Morphine delivered by syringe worked better than anyone had imagined. It was faster, more reliable, more potent. Soldiers who'd been given morphine injections didn't just experience pain relief. They experienced euphoria, a profound sense that everything would be all right, even as they lay on a battlefield surrounded by the dead and dying. That feeling was powerful, more powerful than the medicine alone. It was escape. It was peace in the middle of hell. The problem was that the war didn't end quickly. It dragged on for 4 years, and soldiers who'd been given morphine once often needed it again and again and again. Chronic injuries required chronic pain management. Men who survived amputations lived with phantom limb pain for months and years. Soldiers with dysentery received morphine repeatedly to control symptoms. And slowly, without anyone fully understanding what was happening, thousands upon thousands of soldiers began to develop a desperate need for the substance that had saved them. By the end of the war in 1865, medical historians estimate that as many as 400,000 veterans, both Union and Confederate, had developed morphine addiction. The numbers are imprecise because no one was tracking it systematically, but the anecdotal evidence was overwhelming. Veterans returned home carrying their morphine supplies with them, wearing those leather pouches around their necks like talismans. They couldn't stop using it. When they tried, they experienced withdrawal symptoms that were worse than the original injuries. Sweating, shaking, vomiting, diarrhea, bone-deep pain that made their original wounds seem mild by comparison. They called it soldier's disease. Others called it army disease. It became so common that by the 1870s, morphine addiction wasn't stigmatized the way it would be later. It was simply understood as a consequence of war, a sacrifice that veterans had made, like missing limbs or disfiguring scars. You could recognize addicted veterans by the pouches they wore, by the track marks on their arms where they'd injected themselves repeatedly, by the hollow look in their eyes that came from years of chasing a feeling they could never quite recapture. There was a Confederate veteran named John Tackett Goulrick who embodied this tragedy. Gulrich had fought valiantly during the war, survived multiple battles, and returned home to Virginia in 1865. He'd been given morphine repeatedly for wounds and illness. By the time he came home, he was thoroughly addicted. For the next 30 years, he struggled with his dependence, trying repeatedly to stop, failing every time. His family watched him waste away. His career prospects evaporated, his health deteriorated, and finally, in the 1890s, after 3 decades of morphine slavery, he died, not from his war wounds, but from the medicine that had saved him from the pain of those wounds. Gulrich's story was replicated thousands of times across America. But there's a darker layer to this history that's often overlooked. Black soldiers who fought in the Union Army were systematically denied morphine in many cases. Racist medical theories of the era claimed that black people felt less pain than white people, that their nervous systems were somehow less developed. As a result, black soldiers often received inadequate pain management or none at all. The bitter irony is that this medical racism actually protected many black veterans from developing morphine addiction. They suffered more during the war, but they weren't enslaved to the drug afterward. White veterans, meanwhile, had been treated with the best medicine available, and that medicine had destroyed them. By the 1880s, morphine addiction wasn't limited to veterans. The hypodermic syringe had made the drug accessible to anyone with a doctor willing to prescribe it, and many doctors were willing. Women with menstrual pain, people with chronic headaches, patients with back injuries, the elderly with arthritis. All received morphine injections, and all were at risk of developing the same dependence that had ravaged the veteran population. By 1890, estimates suggested that as many as 1 in every 200 Americans was addicted to morphine or opium. That's roughly 300,000 people in a nation of 60 million. And these weren't criminals or deviants. They were ordinary citizens who'd sought medical care and gotten more than they bargained for. The medical community began to realize the scope of the problem, but they didn't know how to solve it. Morphine was still essential medicine. You couldn't simply ban it. Too many people relied on it for legitimate pain relief. But the addiction crisis was undeniable. Pharmacies did a brisk business in morphine sales, both legal and quasi-legal. Cure operations sprang up, promising to break morphine addiction using various methods, most of which simply substituted one opiate for another. The cycle continued, and then, in the 1870s, chemists began experimenting again. If morphine was too addictive, maybe they could modify its chemical structure to create something safer, something that provided pain relief without the risk of dependence, something that could finally break the cycle that Sertürner had begun back in 1804. The result would be one of the greatest medical catastrophes in history. Because in their attempt to create a safer alternative to morphine, chemists would create something far more dangerous, something that would make morphine addiction look mild by comparison. They would create heroin. In 1874, a British chemist named Charles Romilly, Alder Wright, was conducting research at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Wright was interested in the chemical modification of morphine, specifically whether attaching different molecular groups to the morphine molecule might alter its properties. It was sophisticated chemistry for the era, requiring precision, patience, and a willingness to experiment with compounds whose effects couldn't be predicted. Wright took morphine and treated it with acetic anhydride, a chemical that adds acetyl groups to molecules. The reaction was straightforward enough. The morphine accepted the acetyl groups, and the result was a new compound. diacetylmorphine. Wright had just synthesized what would eventually be known as heroin, though he didn't call it that. He didn't call it anything particularly memorable. It was simply a modified morphine molecule, one of many he was experimenting with. Being a responsible scientist, Wright tested his creation on dogs. The results were disturbing. The dogs exhibited what he described as great prostration, fear, sleepiness rapidly following the administration, the eyes being sensitive, and the heart's action being very much accelerated at first. One dog nearly died. The breathing became shallow and labored. The animals appeared terrified by whatever they were experiencing internally. Wright wrote up his findings and published them in a scientific journal. Then, recognizing that diacetylmorphine appeared to be more dangerous than morphine itself, he abandoned the compound. He moved on to other research. The world forgot about his experiment. For 23 years, diacetylmorphine existed only as a footnote in an obscure chemistry paper, a failed experiment that had taught its creator nothing except that some modifications weren't worth pursuing. And that's where the story should have ended. One chemist's curiosity, tested and found wanting, filed away in the vast archive of things that didn't work. But in 1897, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann, working at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Elberfeld, Germany, synthesized the same compound. Whether Hoffmann knew about Wright's earlier work is unclear. What's certain is that he was working on two projects simultaneously that summer. On August 10, 1897, he successfully synthesized acetylsalicylic acid, what we now call aspirin. 11 days later, on August 23rd, he synthesized diacetylmorphine, two of the most significant drugs in pharmaceutical history, created by the same man in the same month. One would save countless lives with minimal side effects. The other would destroy millions. But in 1897, no one knew which was which yet. Hoffmann's supervisor was a man named Heinrich Dresser, head of Bayer's pharmacology department. Dresser was ambitious, driven, and eager to bring new products to market that would establish Bayer as the premier pharmaceutical company in the world. When Hoffmann presented him with diacetylmorphine, Dresser saw opportunity. He arranged for testing, not on dogs this time, on Bayer employees themselves and on patients in local hospitals. The reports came back overwhelmingly positive. Diacetylmorphine was, according to these initial trials, approximately 10 times more effective than codeine at suppressing coughs. It provided powerful pain relief. And crucially, the test subjects reported that it didn't produce the same drowsiness and constipation that morphine did. It seemed cleaner, smoother, better. Dresser made a calculation that would echo through the next century. He decided that diacetylmorphine was safe enough for commercial production. More than that, he decided it could be marketed as a cure for morphine addiction. After all, if it provided similar benefits without the same side effects, surely it could help wean addicts off morphine. It was a rescue drug, a redemption drug, a heroic drug. That's what they called it, heroin, from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic or strong. The name itself was marketing genius. It sounded powerful, noble, trustworthy. Bayer trademarked the name in 1898 and began mass production. The marketing campaign was aggressive and sophisticated. Bayer advertised heroin directly to physicians, presenting it as a breakthrough in respiratory medicine. It was promoted as a cough suppressant, superior to codeine and safer than morphine. The company produced glossy brochures showing healthy, smiling patients. They distributed free samples to doctors across Europe and America. They published studies, funded by Bayer themselves, that claimed heroin was non-addictive. Read that again, non-addictive. They actually claimed that heroin, a drug that is 2 to 3 times more potent than morphine and crosses the blood-brain barrier faster than any opiate previously known, was not addictive. And doctors believed them. Why wouldn't they? Bayer was a respected pharmaceutical company. They'd done testing, they'd published data, and the drug seemed to work exactly as advertised. It suppressed coughs, it relieved pain, and in the short term, patients didn't seem to develop the same obvious dependence that morphine produced. The short term. That was the key phrase that no one paid enough attention to. Heroin was sold over the counter. You didn't need a prescription. You could walk into any pharmacy in America or Europe and purchase Bayer heroin tablets, cough syrup, or elixir. The bottles were labeled with the Bayer logo, which gave them an air of medical authority. Parents gave it to children for coughs. Doctors prescribed it for minor ailments. It was as commonplace as aspirin, which, ironically, Bayer was also marketing heavily, though with far less enthusiasm than they showed for heroin. Picture a mother in 1905 standing in a Philadelphia pharmacy. Her young son has been coughing for weeks, keeping the family awake at night. The pharmacist recommends Bayer heroin, cough syrup. It's guaranteed to stop the cough, he tells her. Completely safe, made by a reputable German company. She purchases a bottle, takes it home, gives her son a spoonful before bed. The cough stops. Her son sleeps peacefully for the first time in weeks. She's grateful. She buys another bottle when the first runs out, and another, because now, whenever she tries to stop giving him the medicine, the cough comes back worse than before. What she doesn't understand, what no one has explained to her, is that her son isn't coughing anymore because of illness. He's experiencing the early stages of withdrawal. The heroin has changed his brain chemistry, and his body now needs the drug just to feel normal. This scene replicated itself millions of times across 2 continents between 1898 and 1910. Heroin became one of Bayer's best-selling products. It was exported to 23 countries. Bayer produced approximately 1 ton of heroin per year at their peak production. 1 ton of pure diacetyl morphine distributed into cough syrups and pain remedies, and sold to an unsuspecting public that had been assured by medical authorities and corporate marketing that this was safe, effective, modern medicine. But by 1902, only 4 years after heroin's introduction, doctors began reporting troubling cases. Patients who'd been using heroin for coughs were now unable to stop. They claimed they needed it just to function. When they tried to quit, they experienced symptoms far worse than anything morphine withdrawal produced. Violent nausea, muscle spasms, hallucinations, psychological distress so severe that some patients became suicidal. The withdrawal from heroin was morphine withdrawal amplified tenfold, and the addiction developed faster. While morphine addiction might take months or years of regular use to establish itself, heroin addiction could develop in weeks. The drug was simply too potent, too fast-acting, too effective at hijacking the brain's reward systems. Users described the rush from heroin as unlike anything else, a warmth spreading from the injection site through the entire body, an overwhelming sense of euphoria and peace that eclipsed every other concern in life. And once you'd felt that, once your brain had experienced that level of reward, ordinary pleasures became colorless by comparison. By 1910, medical journals were publishing alarmed reports. the American Medical Association began warning about heroin. Studies emerged showing that not only was heroin highly addictive, but it was far more addictive than morphine had ever been. The very drug that had been marketed as a cure for morphine addiction was creating addicts at an unprecedented rate. The backlash was swift, but not swift enough. In 1913, Bayer quietly stopped producing heroin. They removed it from their product line without fanfare, hoping to avoid the reputational damage that was beginning to mount. But the drug was already out there. Other pharmaceutical companies had begun producing their own versions. Street dealers had discovered that heroin could be sold illegally for enormous profits. The genie couldn't be put back in the bottle. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the United States began regulating opiates more strictly, though it didn't ban them outright. Finally, in 1924, the Heroin Act banned the manufacture, possession, and sale of heroin entirely in the United States, even for medical purposes. Other countries followed with their own bans throughout the 1920s and 1930s. But by then, millions of people had been exposed to the drug. Many were already addicted, and the infrastructure for illegal heroin production and distribution had been established. Black markets emerged. Criminal organizations recognized the profit potential. The poppy fields that had supplied Bayer with their raw materials for heroin production didn't disappear. They simply shifted to serving illegal manufacturers instead of pharmaceutical companies. The irony is almost too perfect to be real, except that it is real. The same company that gave the world aspirin, one of the safest and most useful drugs ever created, also gave the world heroin, one of the most destructive. Felix Hoffmann, the chemist who synthesized both, probably never imagined that one of his creations would be used safely by billions of people for over a century, while the other would fuel a global addiction epidemic that continues to this day. And here's the pattern that should be obvious by now, but which somehow keeps getting repeated. Morphine was isolated from opium to create a more reliable medicine. The hypodermic syringe was invented to deliver morphine more effectively. Both innovations led to addiction epidemics. So when morphine addiction became a crisis, what did the medical establishment do? They created a more powerful opiate, heroin, and marketed it as the solution. And when heroin proved even more addictive than morphine, the cycle still didn't stop. The fundamental mistake, repeated over and over, was the belief that the problem could be solved with chemistry. That if we just modified the molecule in the right way, we could keep the benefits and eliminate the addiction. But addiction isn't purely chemical. It's neurological, psychological, social, environmental. You can't chemically engineer away a problem that exists at the intersection of human biology and human suffering. By 1920, the landscape had been irrevocably changed. Morphine remained legal and medically essential. No one could deny its life-saving properties. Heroin had been banned, but was spreading through illegal markets. And humanity was left grappling with a question it still hasn't answered. How do you harness the power of substances that can banish pain without creating the conditions for widespread addiction? That question would become even more urgent as the 20th century progressed, bringing world wars, new technologies, and new understandings of addiction itself. But it would also bring something else, a growing recognition that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't the drugs themselves. Maybe the problem was how we understood pain, suffering, and what it means to seek relief from both. The 20th century forced humanity to confront an uncomfortable truth. Morphine was both essential and dangerous, And those two facts couldn't be separated. You couldn't have one without the other. Every attempt to eliminate the danger had only created new forms of it. And yet, for all the addiction and devastation that opiates had caused, modern medicine couldn't function without them. This paradox became brutally clear during World War II. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Thousands of young men waded through neck-deep water under withering machine gun fire, watched their friends die beside them, and pushed forward into hell itself. The casualties were staggering. Within hours of the initial landing, field medics were overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded soldiers requiring immediate care. Every medic carried a standardized medical kit, and the most important item in that kit was a small syrette of morphine. The syrette was a brilliant piece of engineering, a collapsible tube with an attached needle pre-filled with a precise dose of morphine tartrate. You didn't need to measure anything. You didn't need a separate syringe. You simply uncapped the needle, jabbed it into the soldier's muscle or vein, squeezed the tube, and the morphine was delivered. The whole process took seconds, and after administration, medics were trained to pin the empty syrette to the soldier's collar. This simple act served a crucial purpose. It told the next medic or the surgeon at the field hospital that this man had already received morphine. Don't give him another dose. Don't risk an overdose. The syrette became a visible marker of care received, a communication system written in morphine tubes pinned to bloody uniforms. Picture a beach on D-Day, bodies in the surf, the sound of artillery and small arms fire. A young medic, maybe 19 years old, crawling through sand to reach a wounded soldier whose leg has been shredded by shrapnel. The soldier is screaming. Not words, just pure sound, the kind of noise a human body makes when pain exceeds the brain's capacity to process it. The medic pulls out a morphine syrette, jabs it into the soldier's thigh, squeezes. Within 2 minutes, the screaming stops. The soldier's face relaxes. His eyes, which had been wide with terror and agony, soften into something approaching peace. That morphine syrette just saved that soldier from shock. Without it, the trauma to his body might have triggered cardiovascular collapse. His blood pressure might have dropped fatally. His body might have simply shut down from the overwhelming cascade of pain signals flooding his nervous system. The morphine didn't just ease suffering, it kept him alive long enough to receive proper medical care. Multiply that scene by hundreds of thousands. Every major battle of World War II, in every theater, on every front, North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, the Pacific Islands, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Everywhere men fought and bled, morphine was there, keeping them alive, keeping them functional, allowing field surgeons to operate without patients dying from shock. On the operating table, morphine made modern warfare survivable in a way it had never been before. The casualty rates in World War II were horrific, but they would have been catastrophically worse without morphine. Studies conducted after the war estimated that morphine administration on the battlefield increased survival rates by as much as 20 to 30% for seriously wounded soldiers. That's thousands upon thousands of lives saved by Sertürner's crystalline powder. But the pattern repeated itself. When the war ended in 1945, veterans came home carrying more than just memories and medals. Many brought morphine dependence with them. The Veterans Administration opened nerve block clinics across the United States, specifically to treat veterans suffering from chronic pain and addiction. The cycle that had begun with the Civil War and continued through every subsequent conflict was now deeply embedded in the American military experience. War created wounds. Wounds required morphine. Morphine created dependence. Dependence outlasted the war. Yet medicine couldn't simply abandon opiates. The post-war period saw massive advances in surgical technique, and all of them depended on effective anesthesia and pain management. Open-heart surgery became possible in the 1950s, but only because surgeons could keep patients unconscious and pain-free for hours at a time, using combinations of morphine and other drugs. Cancer treatment advanced, but terminal cancer patients still needed morphine to die with dignity rather than in screaming agony. In 1969, the World Health Organization formally endorsed the medical use of morphine, publishing guidelines that stated morphine does not inevitably lead to dependence when used appropriately for medical purposes. This was an important recognition. The problem wasn't morphine itself, but how it was prescribed, monitored, and controlled. A patient using morphine for post-surgical pain under medical supervision had a very different risk profile than someone self-administering morphine without oversight. But America was about to learn that lesson again in the jungles of Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1973, the United States deployed millions of soldiers to Vietnam in a war that would become synonymous with trauma, disillusionment, and addiction. The conditions were nightmarish. Soldiers fought in dense jungle against an enemy that could be anywhere. They walked through rice paddies, not knowing if the next step would trigger a landmine. They returned from patrols to base camps, where boredom and fear mixed into a psychological poison that drove men to seek any form of escape. And escape was readily available. Heroin was cheap and abundant in Vietnam, smuggled in from the Golden Triangle region of Southeast Asia, where opium production had never stopped. A small packet of heroin that might cost $100 on the streets of New York sold for $5 in Saigon. Soldiers who'd never touched drugs before found themselves using heroin to cope with the stress of combat, the impossibility of distinguishing civilians from enemies, the moral weight of killing, and the knowledge that back home, much of America had turned against the war they were being ordered to fight. By 1971, studies suggested that approximately 20% of American soldiers in Vietnam had tried heroin. 20%. That's 1 in 5. The military was facing an addiction crisis that threatened to undermine operational effectiveness and create a generation of veteran addicts when they returned home. The parallels to the Civil War were impossible to ignore. Once again, American soldiers were being exposed to opiates in a war zone. Once again, addiction seemed inevitable. But something unexpected happened. When soldiers returned from Vietnam, the vast majority of those who'd used heroin simply stopped. They came home and they quit. No treatment programs, no intervention. They just stopped using. This shouldn't have been possible according to prevailing theories about addiction. The medical establishment believed that heroin was so powerfully addictive that once you started using, you couldn't stop without extensive medical intervention. The brain chemistry had been permanently altered. The dependence was physical and irreversible. But the Vietnam veterans proved that wrong. Researchers studied the phenomenon and discovered something crucial. Addiction wasn't purely chemical. Environment mattered enormously. Soldiers had used heroin in Vietnam because Vietnam was a hell they needed to escape from. When they came home, they were no longer in that hell. The environmental triggers disappeared. The stress that had driven them to drugs in the first place was removed. And so despite the supposedly irresistible pull of heroin, Most simply walked away from it. This was a revolutionary finding. It suggested that addiction was far more complex than just chemical hooks in the brain. Yes, opiates created physical dependence. That was undeniable. But whether that dependence turned into long-term addiction depended on a whole constellation of factors: psychological state, environmental stress, social support, purpose in life, trauma history. The drug was only part of the equation. Unfortunately, this nuanced understanding didn't translate into nuanced policy. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, the American medical establishment became increasingly fearful of opiates. The specter of the heroin epidemic, combined with the cultural panic around drug use that characterized the "just say no" era, made doctors hesitant to prescribe opioids even when they were medically appropriate. The pendulum swung hard in the opposite direction. Cancer patients in severe pain were undertreated because doctors feared creating addicts. Post-surgical patients suffered unnecessarily because physicians were reluctant to prescribe adequate pain medication. Chronic pain sufferers, people with back injuries, arthritis, nerve damage, were told to simply endure it, or were given inadequate doses that left them in constant agony. The fear of addiction led to a systematic undertreatment of pain that caused immense unnecessary suffering. Studies from the 1980s showed that up to 50% of hospitalized patients experienced moderate to severe pain that could have been easily controlled with appropriate opioid dosing. But doctors held back, worried about the regulatory scrutiny they might face if they prescribed too much, worried about creating dependent patients, worried about contributing to an addiction epidemic. The result was a generation of patients who suffered needlessly, while effective pain relief sat in locked pharmacy cabinets, available but unutilized. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, patient advocacy groups began pushing back. Pain management specialists argued that there was a humanitarian crisis happening, that we had the tools to eliminate most severe pain, but we weren't using them because of exaggerated fears about addiction. They pointed to studies showing that when opioids were prescribed appropriately for acute pain, addiction rates were extremely low, less than 1% in most cases. The pain management movement introduced the concept that pain is the fifth vital sign, alongside blood pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, and temperature. Doctors should ask about pain systematically. They should treat it aggressively. They should believe patients when they said they were suffering. This was genuinely progressive medicine, born from compassion and supported by legitimate research. But it created an opening, an opportunity, because while academic pain specialists were advocating for better pain treatment within careful medical frameworks, pharmaceutical companies were watching and calculating. They saw a medical culture that was beginning to embrace opioid prescribing again. They saw a massive market of chronic pain sufferers who'd been undertreated for decades. They saw doctors who wanted to help their patients but had been trained to fear opioids. And they saw a chance to make billions of dollars by convincing everyone that they'd finally solved the problem that had haunted medicine for 200 years, that they'd created a new class of opioids that provided morphine's benefits without morphine's dangers, that the cycle could finally be broken with better chemistry, better formulations, better marketing. They were about to prove once again that some lessons are never learned, that pattern recognition apparently doesn't apply when profit is on the line, that every generation believes it's smarter than the last, right up until the moment it makes the exact same mistakes. In 1996, a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, released a new drug called OxyContin. It was essentially morphine in a time-release formulation. The marketing materials called it safe, effective, and with a low potential for abuse. The echoes of Bayer's heroin marketing a century earlier should have been deafening. But nobody seemed to hear them, or maybe they just chose not to listen. At the launch party for OxyContin in 1996, Dr. Richard Sackler, member of the family that owned Purdue Pharma and would profit enormously from the drug's success, stood before the assembled crowd and asked them to envision natural disasters: an earthquake, a hurricane, a blizzard. These catastrophes, he explained, were what people living with untreated pain experienced every day. OxyContin, he promised, would be their rescue. What he didn't mention was that his company was about to unleash its own natural disaster, one that would kill more Americans than every combat death in World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan combined. OxyContin was, at its chemical core, nothing revolutionary. It was oxycodone, a semi-synthetic opioid derived from thebaine, a component of opium, in a controlled-release formulation designed to last 12 hours. The idea was simple. Instead of taking immediate-release pain medication every 4 to 6 hours, patients could take OxyContin twice daily and experience steady, sustained relief. This was genuinely appealing for chronic pain sufferers who wanted to sleep through the night without waking to take medication. But Purdue Pharma's marketing went far beyond promoting convenience. In their launch materials and training documents for sales representatives, they made claims that should have triggered alarm bells across the medical establishment. They claimed that OxyContin's time-release mechanism made it less likely to be abused than other opioids. They distributed materials stating that the risk of addiction was less than 1% when opioids were used for legitimate pain. They trained their sales force to tell doctors that concerns about addiction were overblown, that the real crisis was the undertreatment of pain, not overprescription of opioids. None of these claims were supported by clinical trials. When company officials were later deposed in lawsuits, they admitted that Purdue had never conducted studies to show that OxyContin was less addictive than other opioids. The marketing campaign was based not on science, but on focus groups and profit projections, and it worked spectacularly. Purdue spent between $200 million annually on marketing in the early 2000s, 6 to 12 times more than competitors spent on similar drugs. They flew more than 5,000 physicians, pharmacists, and nurses to all-expenses-paid conferences at luxury resorts in Florida, Arizona, and California. They recruited these healthcare professionals to serve as speakers who would then promote OxyContin to their peers. They understood that doctors trusted other doctors more than they trusted pharmaceutical company representatives. So they turned doctors into their sales force. The campaign included something particularly insidious: direct-to-patient marketing. Purdue produced glossy brochures with titles like OxyContin, a guide to your new pain medicine, that downplayed addiction risk and encouraged patients to ask their doctors specifically for OxyContin. One pamphlet explicitly told patients worried about addiction, drug addiction means using a drug to get high rather than to relieve pain. You are taking opioid pain medication for medical purposes. The medical purposes are clear, and the effects are beneficial, not harmful. It was Bayer's heroin marketing from 1898, repackaged for the 21st century with better graphics and more sophisticated psychological manipulation, sales exploded from $48 million in 1996 to over $1 billion by 2000. By 2001, OxyContin had become one of the most prescribed narcotics in America. Prescriptions for opioids for musculoskeletal pain, back pain, arthritis, chronic injuries increased 20-fold between 1996 and 2000. Doctors who had been trained to fear opioids were now writing prescriptions freely, reassured by Purdue's marketing and by the pain management movement's legitimate push to treat suffering more aggressively. But by 2001, reports began surfacing of a crisis. In rural communities, particularly in Appalachia and the Rust Belt, where economic despair and lack of opportunity created fertile ground for addiction, OxyContin was devastating entire towns. People discovered that if you crushed the time-release tablet, you bypassed the controlled release mechanism and got an instant, intense morphine-like high. You could snort it, inject it. The drug that was supposed to prevent abuse was remarkably easy to abuse. Emergency rooms saw an influx of overdoses. Pharmacies were being robbed specifically for OxyContin. People with legitimate prescriptions were selling their pills on the black market for massive profits. An 80-milligram OxyContin tablet that cost a few dollars with insurance could sell for $60 to $80 on the street. And people who'd been prescribed OxyContin for legitimate pain were discovering that when they tried to stop, they experienced withdrawal symptoms identical to heroin withdrawal. Because chemically, oxycodone and heroin are cousins, both derived from the same opium poppy, both binding to the same receptors in the brain. In 2007, Purdue Pharma pleaded guilty to criminal charges of misbranding OxyContin by claiming it was less addictive and less subject to abuse than other opioids. The company and 3 executives paid $634 million in fines. It was a staggering sum. It was also a fraction of the profits they'd already made. By that point, Purdue had earned more than $35 billion from OxyContin sales. The Sackler family, who'd presented themselves as philanthropists, their names adorning museums and universities, had extracted billions in profits from the epidemic their company had helped create. And even after the guilty plea, even after the fines, the prescriptions didn't stop. The marketing continued, just more subtly. Internal documents revealed years later showed that Sackler family members remained deeply involved in pushing sales, even as the death toll mounted. In a 2007 email, Richard Sackler asked whether the company could somehow blame overdose deaths on the people who died, calling them culpable and criminals. The victims weren't victims, in his view. They were problems that threatened profits. By 2000, prescribing guidelines began tightening. Regulatory scrutiny increased. Doctors became more cautious. But for millions of Americans who'd been prescribed OxyContin or other opioids and had developed dependence, the tightening of prescriptions created a new crisis. When they could no longer get legal prescriptions, they turned to the illegal market. And on the illegal market, they found something that made OxyContin look gentle by comparison. They found heroin, now cheaper and more available than it had been in decades. And, increasingly, they found fentanyl. Fentanyl had been synthesized in 1959 by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen. It was designed for use in surgery and was extraordinarily potent, 50 to 100 times stronger than morphine. Under medical supervision, administered in controlled doses, it was incredibly useful. But illicitly manufactured fentanyl, smuggled primarily from Mexico, where it was made using precursor chemicals from China, began flooding American drug markets in the 2010s. Drug dealers cut heroin with fentanyl to increase potency. They pressed fentanyl into counterfeit pills designed to look like legitimate prescription opioids. The problem was that fentanyl's potency meant that the difference between a dose that produced a high and a dose that stopped your breathing was tiny. 2 milligrams, an amount that would fit on the tip of a pencil, could be lethal. And because fentanyl was mixed into heroin and pressed into pills by dealers with no quality control, users had no way to know how much they were taking. The death toll accelerated horrifically. In 2020, there were approximately 69,000 drug overdose deaths involving opioids in the United States. In 2021, that number jumped to over 80,000. By 2022, more than 100,000 Americans were dying annually from drug overdoses, with synthetic opioids like fentanyl accounting for roughly 70,000 of those deaths. 100,000 deaths per year. That's the equivalent of a fully loaded passenger jet crashing every single day with no survivors. For context, more Americans have died from opioid overdoses since 1999 than died in all American wars from the Revolutionary War through Afghanistan combined. The epidemic has killed more than 600,000 people in 2 decades. And here's the bitter paradox that makes this crisis so complex. While people were dying by the tens of thousands from illegal opioids, legitimate chronic pain patients were being denied access to the medications that could improve their quality of life. The pendulum swung again. Doctors, terrified of regulatory action or malpractice lawsuits, became reluctant to prescribe opioids even when they were medically appropriate. Cancer patients in severe pain struggled to get adequate medication. People with debilitating injuries were told to try physical therapy or meditation instead of receiving pain relief that could allow them to function. The crisis created 2 simultaneous tragedies: people dying from too many opioids and people suffering needlessly from too few. The problem was never morphine itself, or OxyContin, or even fentanyl. The problem was how these substances were marketed, prescribed, regulated, and distributed. The problem was a pharmaceutical company that valued profits over lives. The problem was a medical system that swung between extremes instead of finding nuanced middle ground. The problem was a society that criminalized addiction instead of treating it as a medical condition. The problem was economic despair that made escape through drugs seem like the only relief available. Picture an emergency room in 2021. A young man, 27 years old, is wheeled in after being found unresponsive. The paramedics have already administered naloxone, the opioid reversal drug, twice. His breathing is shallow. His lips are blue. The doctors work frantically. They give him more naloxone. His heart rate spikes. He gasps, vomits, comes back. He'd taken what he thought was a 30 milligram oxycodone tablet he bought from someone he knew. It wasn't oxycodone. It was a counterfeit pill pressed with fentanyl. He'd taken it because 3 years earlier, a doctor prescribed him OxyContin after a car accident. When the prescription ran out, he was already dependent. He tried to stop. The withdrawal was unbearable. He turned to buying pills illegally. He told himself he'd quit soon. He told himself he had it under control. And then, one day, he took a pill that was just slightly stronger than the others, and it nearly killed him. This scene plays out thousands of times every week across America. The doctors who save these patients are using the same opioid system to reverse the overdoses. Naloxone works by blocking opioid receptors, essentially competing with morphine, heroin, or fentanyl for binding sites in the brain. It's temporary though. Once the naloxone wears off, if there's still fentanyl in the patient's system, they can slip back into overdose. Some require multiple doses, some don't make it. And yet, even as this epidemic rages, morphine itself remains essential to medicine. Every day, in operating rooms across the world, morphine and its derivatives allow surgeons to perform procedures that would be impossible without effective anesthesia. Cancer patients in hospice receive morphine to ease their final days, to die with dignity rather than in agony. Children with severe injuries receive morphine in emergency rooms. The drug that Sertürner isolated in 1804 is still the gold standard against which all other pain relievers are measured. We can't uninvent morphine. We can't make opioid receptors disappear from the human brain. We can't eliminate the poppy fields that have existed for 5,000 years. Even now, in 2025, Afghanistan produces between 66 and 90% of the world's opium, despite decades of eradication efforts. The poppy fields in Helmand province, where farmers score pods and collect resin using methods identical to those of ancient Sumerians, continue to supply the raw material for both legal morphine production and illegal heroin manufacturing. The cycle persists, the poppy grows, the latex oozes, the resin is collected, and somewhere down the supply chain, it becomes either medicine or poison, depending on context, dosage, and purpose. The flower itself is neutral. It doesn't judge. It simply offers what it has always offered, the power to banish pain and the power to enslave. In recent years, pharmaceutical companies and researchers have worked to develop non-addictive pain relievers, benefits, without activating the reward pathways that lead to addiction. Some target different pain receptors. Some use entirely different mechanisms. But as of 2025, none have proven as effective as morphine for severe pain. None have managed to do what Sertürner set out to do 221 years ago, provide reliable, powerful pain relief that doesn't carry the risk of dependence. The quest continues. Scientists study the neurobiology of addiction, trying to understand why some people can use opioids medically without issue, while others develop immediate dependence. Policymakers debate harm reduction strategies, supervised injection sites, more accessible naloxone, decriminalization of drug use. Doctors try to find the balance between treating pain adequately and avoiding creating new addicts. But the fundamental tension remains unresolved. We need morphine, and morphine needs us, or rather it reshapes us, rewires our neural pathways, teaches our brains to crave it above all else if we're not careful. It is both humanity's greatest medical achievement and one of our most persistent forms of self-destruction. And standing at the center of this paradox, if we could somehow speak to him across 2 centuries, is Friedrich Sertürner, the orphaned boy who ground opium resin in a cramped apothecary shop, driven by curiosity and the belief that understanding could lead to progress. He gave us precision. He gave us the power to eliminate suffering in ways ancient physicians could only dream of. He gave us the tool that would save countless millions from unbearable pain. And he gave us the seed of an epidemic that continues to claim 100,000 lives every year. Was he a benefactor of humanity, as the French Academy proclaimed? Or did he unleash something that humanity wasn't ready to handle responsibly? The answer, maddeningly, is both. And that answer offers no comfort, no resolution, only the sober recognition that some achievements contain their own destruction, and some discoveries cannot be undiscovered, no matter how much harm they cause. The morphine that saves the cancer patient is the same morphine that enslaves the addict. The chemistry doesn't change, only the context does. And context, it turns out, is everything and nothing at the same time. There's a photograph that haunts me, though I've never seen it. I can only imagine it based on descriptions in historical texts. It shows a poppy field somewhere in Turkey or Afghanistan, or perhaps northern India, the exact location lost to the passage of time. Row upon row of Papaver somniferum plants in full bloom, their petals ranging from white to pink to deep purple, swaying in wind that has blown across these same fields for thousands of years. And among them, a farmer, perhaps wearing traditional clothing, perhaps dressed in modern garments. It doesn't matter. Moving between the plants with a small blade, scoring the seed pods with practiced precision. This scene has played out essentially unchanged for 54 centuries. The Sumerian priests did this in 3400 BCE. The Egyptian cultivators did this in the time of the pharaohs. Turkish farmers did this during the Ottoman Empire. Afghan farmers do this today. The technique hasn't evolved because it doesn't need to. You score the pod. The latex bleeds. You collect the resin. It's agriculture in its purest form. Human beings discovering what a plant offers and learning to harvest it generation after generation. And from that simple ancient act flows everything we've discussed. The morphine that Friedrich Sertürner isolated came from poppies harvested this way. The opium that created Civil War addicts came from these fields. The heroin that Bayer marketed came from this latex. The OxyContin that killed tens of thousands was synthesized from compounds derived from this plant. The fentanyl that kills 100,000 Americans every year is attempting to chemically recreate what this flower produces naturally. We've spent 5,000 years trying to master the poppy, and the poppy remains utterly indifferent to our efforts. It simply grows, produces its latex, and offers its alkaloids to whoever chooses to harvest them. We've isolated its compounds, modified them, synthesized new versions, regulated them, banned them, and fought wars over them. And through all of it, the poppy continues doing what it's always done, producing morphine with perfect consistency, completely oblivious to the chaos that substance causes in human civilization. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of morphine's history. Nature doesn't care about our moral judgments. The poppy isn't good or evil. Morphine isn't a blessing or a curse. These are human constructs, human interpretations of something that simply exists. The molecule is neutral. It binds to opioid receptors in the brain because those receptors happen to have a shape that fits morphine's molecular structure. There's no intent, no purpose, no judgment, just chemistry. But we are not neutral. We feel pain, and we desperately want relief from it. We experience suffering, physical, emotional, existential, and we search constantly for ways to ease that suffering. And when we find something that works as effectively as morphine, we embrace it with a fervor that borders on worship. Because morphine doesn't just reduce pain. It doesn't just quiet the nerves. It transforms the entire experience of being human in the moment. It takes unbearable and makes it bearable. It takes agony and converts it to peace. It gives us, however briefly, a glimpse of what life might feel like without suffering. That's an incredibly seductive promise. And it's a promise that morphine delivers on, at least temporarily. The cancer patient in hospice who receives morphine isn't being fooled or deceived. The pain genuinely stops. The soldier on the battlefield who receives a morphine injection isn't experiencing a Placebo effect. The compound is actually shutting down pain, signaling pathways in his nervous system. The person having open-heart surgery isn't pretending to be unconscious, while morphine and anesthetics flow through their bloodstream. They genuinely can't feel the surgeon cutting through their chest. These are real miracles, small ones perhaps in the grand scheme of medical advancement, but to the person experiencing them, they're everything. They're the difference between dying in screaming agony and dying peacefully, between enduring surgery awake or sleeping through it, between bleeding out from shock on a battlefield or surviving long enough to reach a hospital. Morphine has saved millions of lives. Tens of millions probably, if you count every person over the past 2 centuries who survived trauma, surgery, or disease specifically because morphine controlled their pain enough to prevent shock or allow medical intervention. This isn't speculation or exaggeration, it's documented medical fact. Modern surgery would be impossible without morphine and its derivatives. Modern battlefield medicine would be impossible. End-of-life care would return to the dark ages of people dying in unspeakable suffering. So when we call Sertürner a benefactor of humanity, that title isn't ironic, it's accurate. He did benefit humanity enormously. The isolation of morphine ranks among the most important medical discoveries in human history, alongside vaccines, antibiotics, and anesthesia. The World Health Organization lists morphine as an essential medicine, something that every healthcare system should have available, because the need for it is universal and its benefits are irreplaceable. But there's always a but with morphine, isn't there? But morphine has also enslaved millions. The Civil War veterans wearing leather pouches of morphine around their necks, unable to function without regular doses. The Victorian women, far more than men, who became dependent on morphine prescribed for menstrual pain or hysteria, and spent decades trapped in addiction. The heroin epidemic that Bayer unleashed, destroying communities across America and Europe. The soldiers returning from every war we've fought, from the Civil War through Afghanistan, carrying morphine dependence alongside their physical wounds. And now, the modern opioid epidemic that has killed more than 600,000 Americans in just over 2 decades. These aren't acceptable casualties. These aren't necessary sacrifices. These are people whose lives were destroyed by the same substance that saved others. The teenage boy who got prescribed OxyContin after a football injury and died 3 years later from fentanyl overdose. He's just as dead as the cancer patient who was saved by morphine is alive. The young woman who tried heroin because it was cheaper than the prescription opioids she could no longer afford, who overdosed in a gas station bathroom and was found too late for naloxone to save her. Her death is as real as the soldier's survival. This is the paradox that has no resolution. Morphine is simultaneously one of humanity's greatest achievements and one of our greatest sources of self-destruction. These facts don't balance each other out. They don't cancel each other. They coexist in permanent, uncomfortable tension. And we cannot escape this tension by banning morphine. That would condemn millions to unnecessary suffering and make modern medicine impossible. We cannot escape it by making morphine freely available. That would create addiction on a scale that would dwarf even the current crisis. We cannot escape it through chemistry. Every attempt to create a safe opiate has produced something as dangerous or more dangerous than morphine. We cannot escape it through education alone. Knowing that opiates are addictive doesn't prevent addiction when you're in severe pain, and morphine is the only thing that helps. The pattern that emerges from 5,000 years of opium use and 200 years of morphine use is clear. Every generation believes it can solve this problem. Every generation thinks it's smarter than the last, that it has better technology or better understanding or better policies. And every generation ends up learning the same lesson at tremendous cost. You cannot have morphine's benefits without its dangers. They're inseparable. They're encoded into the same molecular structure, the same receptor binding, the same neurological pathways. Sertürner understood this to some degree. His self-experimentation in 1804, when he nearly killed himself and 3 young boys, taught him that morphine was powerful enough to be deadly. He wrote about its terrible effects in his papers. He warned that it should be used with extreme caution. But even he couldn't have imagined the scale of what he'd unleashed, that his crystalline powder would eventually contribute to epidemics that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives. Would he have stopped if he'd known? Would he have destroyed his research, abandoned his experiments, taken the secret of morphine extraction to his grave? We can't know. But I suspect not, because the medical benefits were too obvious, too immediate, too desperately needed. In an era when surgery was performed on fully conscious patients held down by strong men, when infection killed more soldiers than bullets, when diseases like cancer meant months of increasing agony with no relief whatsoever. In that context, morphine wasn't just useful. It was revolutionary. The tragedy is that both outcomes, the salvation and the destruction, were predictable. We knew from thousands of years of opium use that the substance created dependence. We saw it happen with morphine after Sertürner's isolation. We saw it happen spectacularly with the hypodermic syringe. We saw it happen catastrophically with heroin. We saw it happen with the prescription opioid epidemic, and each time we were somehow surprised. Each time we thought this iteration would be different. This suggests something uncomfortable about human nature. We want to believe that problems have solutions, that if we just apply enough intelligence, enough technology, enough policy intervention, we can engineer away the negative consequences and keep only the benefits. This works for many things. We've built bridges that don't collapse, planes that don't crash, computers that process information at speeds incomprehensible a few decades ago. We've solved problems that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. But morphine resists solution, because the problem of morphine is actually several distinct problems that interact in complex ways. There's the chemical problem, morphine's molecular structure and how it interacts with the brain. There's the medical problem, how to provide adequate pain relief without creating dependence. There's the social problem, why some people use opiates medicinally without issue, while others become addicted immediately. There's the economic problem, pharmaceutical companies profiting from addiction. There's the policy problem, how to regulate substances that are both essential medicines and dangerous drugs. There's the existential problem, what it means that humans seek to escape suffering, and whether that's something we should even try to prevent. None of these problems has a solution in the traditional sense. They have only trade-offs. Better policies might reduce addiction rates, but could also prevent legitimate pain patients from getting treatment. Stricter regulations might limit overprescription, but could also make necessary medications harder to access. Better education might help some people avoid addiction, but won't help those whose addiction stems from trauma or despair or neurological vulnerability. Even the promise of non-addictive pain relievers something researchers have chased for decades, has so far produced nothing as effective as morphine for severe pain. So we're left with the gift and the curse, inseparably bound. We're left making impossible choices. The doctor who prescribes opioids to a patient in severe pain is making a choice. Risk addiction to relieve suffering. The doctor who refuses to prescribe opioids is also making a choice. Accept suffering to avoid addiction. Neither choice is clearly right. Both cause harm. The only difference is who bears that harm. The Vietnam War veterans who stopped using heroin when they came home revealed something crucial. Context matters enormously. They used heroin in Vietnam because Vietnam was hell, and heroin offered escape. Remove the hell, and many could leave the heroin behind. This suggests that addiction isn't purely about the drug. It's about the interaction between the drug and the person's life circumstances. A person in chronic pain with no other relief options may develop dependence. A person with severe trauma may self-medicate with opiates. A person with no purpose, no community, no hope may choose chemical escape. This means that addressing the opioid crisis requires more than just controlling drug access. It requires addressing the conditions that make drugs appealing in the first place. Economic despair, social isolation, untreated mental illness, chronic pain without adequate medical care. These are harder problems to solve than writing regulations or funding enforcement. They require systemic change that takes generations. But we're impatient. We want quick fixes. We want someone to be clearly at fault. Blame the pharmaceutical companies, blame the dealers, blame the addicts themselves, blame the doctors, blame the regulators who failed to regulate. And there's truth in all of those accusations. Purdue Pharma did lie about OxyContin's addiction risk. Dealers do cut drugs with fentanyl without regard for human life. Some doctors did overprescribe. Regulators did fail to act quickly enough. But blame doesn't bring back the 600,000 dead. It doesn't ease the suffering of chronic pain patients denied medication. It doesn't solve the fundamental tension between relief and addiction. It just makes us feel like we understand what happened, like we could prevent it from happening again if we just assign responsibility correctly. The harder truth is that this will happen again. Maybe not with morphine or OxyContin or fentanyl. Maybe with something we haven't discovered yet. But as long as humans experience pain and suffering, physical, emotional, existential, we will seek relief. And when we find substances that provide that relief powerfully and immediately, we will embrace them. And some of us will become trapped by them. This isn't a moral failing. It's not a lack of willpower or education or character. It's the predictable result of taking substances that hijack the brain's reward systems, especially when those substances are being used to escape from unbearable conditions. Morphine doesn't care about any of this. The molecule continues doing what it's always done, binding to opioid receptors, shutting down pain signals, triggering dopamine release. It's completely neutral, completely consistent. We're the ones who vary. We're the ones who experience it as salvation or curse, depending on context, dosage, duration, life circumstances, genetic vulnerability, trauma history, and a dozen other factors we barely understand. And so we return to where we began, to that cramped apothecary shop in Paderborn, Germany, in 1804. To Friedrich Sertürner, hunched over his workbench, watching crystalline white powder precipitate from black opium resin. In that moment, he held both miracle and catastrophe in his hands. He gave humanity the power to banish pain with unprecedented precision. And he gave humanity a new form of slavery. He was 21 years old, an orphan with nothing to lose, driven by curiosity and the revolutionary belief that understanding opium's chemistry could improve human welfare. And he was right. His discovery did improve human welfare, incalculably so. Modern medicine wouldn't exist without it. But he was also catastrophically wrong about our ability to wield that power responsibly. Or perhaps he wasn't wrong. Perhaps he simply understood something we keep forgetting, that some powers are too great to be wielded without cost, and the cost is built into the power itself, and we must accept both or accept neither. We chose to accept both. We continue to choose it every day. In every operating room where morphine enables life-saving surgery, in every hospice where morphine grants dignity to the dying, in every emergency room where morphine prevents shock from killing trauma victims, and in every overdose death, every addiction that destroys a life, every family torn apart by opiates. This is the entire history of morphine, from ancient sacred leaf to modern global crisis. A story of chemistry and hubris, of relief and ruin, of a single flower that has shaped civilization for longer than recorded history itself. A story that hasn't ended, that won't end, because the poppy keeps growing and humans keep suffering. And the distance between those two facts is measured in alkaloids that offer escape at a price we never stop paying. The fields in Helmand province look exactly like the fields in ancient Sumer looked 54 centuries ago. The farmers score the pods the same way. The latex oozes the same shade of white. The resin darkens in the sun to the same shade of brown. Nothing has changed except our understanding of why it works, and that understanding has not freed us. The poppy doesn't judge, it simply offers what it has always offered, escape. And humanity, standing in those fields, as we have for 5,000 years, must decide again and again whether to accept that offer. We keep accepting. The gift comes with a curse. The curse comes with a gift. And somewhere between those two truths, measured in lives saved and lives destroyed, we stumble forward, never solving the paradox, never escaping the cycle, forever trapped in the amber of our own need for relief from suffering. This is what Sertürner gave us. This is what we cannot give back. This is morphine, both salvation and slavery, forever.